Walk Two Moons, Set 4, Chapters 11 through 14. Flanagan. Early the next morning, we left Wisconsin and drove on, eating up the road through the lower rim of Minnesota. The land here was hilly and green, forests tucked in close beside the road, and the air smelled of pine. At last, Gramps said, some scenery. I love a place that has scenery. Don't you, Chickabiddy? I had not said anything about what had happened the day before, about being scared down to my very bones when I thought they had left me. I don't know what came over me. Ever since my mother left us that April day, I suspected that everyone was going to leave one by one. I was glad to be able to go on with Phoebe's story. Because when I was talking about Phoebe, I wasn't thinking about much else. Did Phoebe get any more messages? Graham asked. She did. The following Saturday, Phoebe and I were going to Mary Lou's again. As we left Phoebe's house, there on the front steps was another white envelope with a blue sheet of paper inside. The message was, everyone has his own agenda. Phoebe and I looked up and down the street. There was no signs of the message leaver. Mary Lou thought the messages, this one and the other one, was intriguing. How exciting, she said. I wish someone would leave me messages. Phoebe thought the messages were spooky. It was not the words that bothered her. Nothing too frightening there. It was the idea of someone sneaking around and leaving them on her porch. She worried that someone was watching the house, waiting for the right moment to leave the message. Phoebe was a champion worrier. We tried to figure out what the message meant. Okay, Phoebe said. An agenda is a list of things to be discussed at a meeting. So maybe it's your dad, I suggested. Does he go to meetings? Well, I guess, Phoebe said. He's ever so busy all day long. Maybe it's from his boss, Mary Lou said. Maybe your father hasn't been conducting his meetings very well. My father is very organized, Phoebe said. What about the other message? Mary Lou said. Don't judge a man until you've walked 2 moons in his moccasins. I know what it means, I said. I've heard my father use it lots of times. I used to imagine that there were 2 moons sitting in a pair of Indian shoes, but my father said it means that you shouldn't judge someone until you've walked in their moccasins, until you've been in their shoes, in their place. And your father says it often? Phoebe said. I know what you're thinking, I said, but my father isn't creeping around leaving those messages. It isn't his handwriting. When Ben came into Mary Lou's room, she asked him what he thought it meant. He took a sheet of paper from her desk and quickly drew a cartoon. It was a little spooky because what he drew was identical to what I used to imagine. A pair of Indian moccasins with 2 moons in them. Maybe, Mary Lou said to Phoebe, your father is being too quick to judge people at work. He needs to walk in their moccasins first. My father does not judge too quickly, Phoebe said. You don't have to get defensive, Ben said. I'm not getting defensive. I'm just telling you that my father does not judge too quickly. Later, we went to the drugstore. I thought it was going to be only me and Phoebe and Mary Lou going, but by the time we left the house, we had accumulated Tommy and Dougie as well. At the last minute, Ben said he was coming too. I don't know how you can stand it, Phoebe said to Mary Lou. Stand what? Phoebe pointed to Tommy and Dougie, who were running around like wound up toys, making airplane noises and train noises and zooming in between us and then running up ahead and falling over each other and crying and then leaping back up again and socking each other and chasing after bumblebees. I'm used to it, Mary Lou said. My brothers are always doing beef brain things. Ben walked right behind me all the way, which made me nervous. I kept turning around to see what he was doing back there, but he was just strolling along smiling. Tommy bashed into me, and then I started to fall backward. Ben caught me. He put his arms around my waist and held on to me, even after it was obvious that I was not going to fall. I could smell that funny grapefruit smell again and feel his face pressed up against my hair. Let go, I said, but he didn't let go. I had an odd sensation as if a little creature was crawling up my spine. It wasn't a horrible sensation, more light and tickly. I thought maybe he'd drop something down my shirt. Let go, I said, and finally he did. It was at the drugstore that I got a little scared. Maybe I'd been listening to Phoebe's tales of lunatics and axe murderers too much. Phoebe and I were looking at the magazines when I felt as if someone was watching us. I looked over to where Ben was standing, but he and Mary Lou were busy rummaging around in the chocolate balls. The feeling did not go away. I turned the other way around, and there, on the far side of the store, was the nervous young man who had come to Phoebe's house. He was at the cash register paying for something, but he was staring at us while he was handing his money to the clerk. I nudged Phoebe. "Oh, no," she said. "The lunatic!" Phoebe hustled over to Ben and Mary. Look, look, quick, it's the lunatic. Where? At the cash register. There's nobody there, Mary Lou said. Honest, he was there, Phoebe said. I swear he was. Ask Sal. He was there, I said. Later, when we had left Mary Lou and were on our way to Phoebe's house, we heard someone running up behind us. Phoebe thought that we were doomed. If we get our heads bashed in and the lunatic leaves us here on the sidewalk, she said. I felt a hand on my shoulder and I opened my mouth to scream, but something came out. My brain was saying, scream, scream, but my voice was completely shut off. It was Ben. He said, Did I scare you? That wasn't very funny, Phoebe said. I'll walk home with you, he said, just in case there are any lunatics around. He had difficulty saying lunatic. On the way to Phoebe's house, Ben said some odd things. First he said, maybe you shouldn't call him a lunatic. And why not? Phoebe said. Because a lunatic is, it sounds like, oh, never mind. He would not explain, and he seemed embarrassed to have mentioned this in the first place. Then he said to me, don't people touch each other at your house? What's that supposed to mean? I just wondered, he said. You flinch every time someone touches you. I do not. You do. He touched my arm. I have to admit, my instinct was to flinch, but I caught myself. I pretended not to notice that his hand was resting there on my arm. That creature tickling my spine was back. He said, like a doctor examining a patient. He removed his hand. Where's your mother? I had not mentioned my mother to anyone, not even Phoebe, except for the one time Phoebe had asked about her, and I had only said that she didn't live with us. Ben said, I saw your father once, but I've never seen your mother. Where is she? She's in Idaho. Lewiston, Idaho. What's she doing there? Ben said. I really don't feel like saying. It didn't occur to me to ask him where his mother was. He touched my arm again. When I flinched, he said, Ha! Gotcha! It bothered me, what he had said. It occurred to me that my father didn't hug me as much anymore, and that maybe I was starting to flinch whenever anyone touched me. I wasn't always like that. We used to be a hugging family. As I walked along with Ben and Phoebe, I remembered a time when I was 9 or 10. My mother crawled into bed with me and snuggled close and said, let's build a raft and float away down a river. I used to think about that raft a lot, and I actually believed that one day we might build a raft and float away down a river together. But when she went to Lewiston, Idaho, she went alone. Ben touched Phoebe's arm. She flinched. Ha! He said. Gotcha. You're jumpy too, free bee. And that too bothered me. I'd already noticed how tense Phoebe's whole family seemed, how tidy, how respectable, how thumpingly stiff. Was I becoming like that? Why would they like that? A couple times I'd seen Phoebe's mother try to touch Phoebe or Prudence or Mr. Winterbottom. They all drew back from her. It was as if they had outgrown her. Had I been drawn away from my own mother? Did she have empty spaces left over? Was that why she left? When we reached Phoebe's driveway, Ben said, I guess you're safe now. I guess I'll go. Go ahead, Phoebe said. Mrs. Cadaver came screeching up to the curb in her yellow Volkswagen with her wild red witch hair flying all over the place. She waved at us and started pulling things out of the car and plopping them on the sidewalk. Who's that? Ben asked. Mrs. Cadaver. Cadaver? Like dead body? That's right. Hi, Sal, Mrs. Cadaver called. She dumped a pile of lumpy bags on the sidewalk. Ben asked her if she wanted any help. My, you're polite, Mrs. Cadaver said, flashing her wild gray eyes. She scares me half to death, Phoebe said. Don't go inside, she whispered to Ben. Why not? He said too loudly because Mrs. Cadaver looked up and said, What? Oh, nothing, Phoebe said. Mrs. Cadaver said, Sal, do you want to come in? I was just going to Phoebe's, I said, glad for an excuse. Phoebe's mother came to her front door. Phoebe, what are you doing? Are you coming in? We left Ben. As we were going in Phoebe's house, we saw Ben lift something off the sidewalk. It was a shiny new axe. Phoebe's mother said, Is that Mary Lou's brother? Was he walking you home? Where's Mary Lou? I hate it when you ask me 3 questions in a row, Phoebe said. Through the window, we could see Ben lugging the axe up the front steps of Mrs. Cadaver's house. Phoebe called out, Don't go in! But when Mrs. Cadaver held the front door open, Ben disappeared inside. Phoebe, what are you doing? Her mother asked. Then Phoebe pulled the envelope out of her pocket. The envelope contained a new message. I found this outside, Phoebe said. Mrs. Winterbottom opened the envelope carefully as it might contain a miniature bomb. Oh, sweetie, she said. Who's it from? Who's it for? What does it mean? Phoebe explained what an agenda was. I know what an agenda is, Phoebe. I don't like this at all. I want to know who's sending these. I was waiting for Phoebe to tell her about seeing the nervous young man at the drugstore, but Phoebe didn't mention it. A little later, we saw Ben leave Mrs. Cadaver. He appeared to be all in one piece. That day, when I got home, my father was in the garage tinkering with the car. He was leaning over the engine, and I couldn't see his face at first. Dad, what do you think it means if someone touches someone else and the person being touched flinches? Do you think it means that the person being touched is getting too stiff? Dad turned slowly around. His eyes were red and puffy. I think he had been crying. His hands and shirt were greasy, but when he hugged me, I didn't flinch. The marriage bed. When I had first started telling Phoebe's story, Graham and Gramps sat quietly and listened. Gramps concentrated on the road and Graham gazed out the window. Occasionally they interjected a "Gol dang" or "No kidding." But as I got farther into the story, they began to interrupt more and more. When I told about the message, everyone has his own agenda, Graham thumped on the dashboard and said, Isn't that the truth? Lordy, isn't that what it is all about? I said, How do you mean? Well, everyone is just walking along concerned with his own problems, his own life, his own worries, and we're all expecting other people to tune into our own agenda. Look at my worry. Worry with me. Step in my life. Care about my problems. Care about me. Graham sighed. Graham scratched his head. You turned into a philosopher or something? Mind your own agenda, she said. When I mentioned that Ben asking where my mother was and my saying that she was in Lewiston, but that I didn't want to elaborate, Graham and Graham looked at each other. Graham said, One time my father took off for 6 months and didn't tell a soul where he was going. When my best friend asked me where my father was, I hauled off and punched him in the jaw. My best friend. I punched him dang in the jaw. You never told me that, Graham said. I hoped he socked you back. Gramps pointed to a gap in his teeth. See that? He knocked my tooth dang out. And when I told Gramps about flinching when Ben touched me, and about how I went home and found Dad in the garage, Gram unbuckled her seatbelt, turned all the way around, and leaned over the back of her seat. She took my hand and kissed it. Gramps said, Give her one for me, too. And so Graham kissed my hand again. Several times when I described Phoebe's world of lunatics and axe murderers, Graham said, Just like Gloria? I swear to goodness, just exactly like Gloria. Once after she said this, Gramps got a dreamy look on his face, and Graham said, Quit that mooning over Gloria. I know what you're thinking, Gramps said. Hear that, chickabiddy? This here gooseberry knows everything that runs through my head. Isn't she something? Just before we reached the South Dakota border, Gramps took a detour north because he had seen a sign advertising the Pipestone National Monument in Pipestone, Minnesota. On the sign was a picture of an Indian smoking a pipe. What do you want to go see an Indian smoking a pipe for? Gram asked. She didn't like the term Native American any more than my mother did. I just do, Gramps said. We might never get the chance again. To see an Indian smoking a pipe? Gram said. Will it take very long? I asked, and the air screamed. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Not too long, Chickabiddy. We've got to cool off our carburetors. These roads are taking the poop out of me. The detour to Pinestone wound through a cool, dark forest, and if you closed your eyes and smelled the air, you could smell Bob Banks, Kentucky. Pipestone was a small town. Everywhere we went, people were talking to each other, standing there talking, or sitting on a bench talking, or walking along the street talking. When we passed by, they looked up at us right into our faces and said hi or howdy. And although it sounds corny to say it, we felt right at home there. It was so like Bob Banks, where everyone you see stops to say something because they know you and they have known you their whole lives. We went to Pipestone National Monument and saw Indians thunking away at the stone in the quarry. I asked one if he was a Native American, but he said, No, I'm a person. I said, But are you a Native American person? He said, No, I'm an American Indian person. I said, So am I, in my blood. We watched other American Indian persons making pipes out of the stone. In the Pipe Museum, we learned more about pipes than any human being ought to know. In a little clearing outside the museum, an American Indian person was sitting on a tree stump smoking a long peace pipe. After watching him for about 5 minutes, Gramps asked if he could try it. The man passed Gramps the pipe, and Gramps sat down on the grass, took two puffs, and passed it to Gram. She didn't even blink. She took two puffs and passed it to me. There was a sweet, sticky taste on the end of the pipe. With the stem in my mouth, I gave it two little kisses, which is what it looked like Grandma Gramps had done. The smoke came into my mouth, and I held it there while I passed the pipe back. I held the smoke in my mouth while Grandma Gramps puffed some more. I was feeling slightly wang-doodled. I opened my mouth a wee bit, and a tiny stream of smoke curled out into the air. And when I saw that, for some reason, I was reminded of my mother. It didn't make any sense, but my brain was saying, There goes your mother. And I watched the trail of smoke disappear into the air. In the shop attached to the pipe museum, Gramps bought two peace pipes. One was for him, and one was for me. It's not for smoking with, he said. It's for remembering with. That night we stayed in Injun Joe's Peace Palace Motel. On the sign in the lobby, someone had crossed out Injun and written Native American. So the whole sign read Native American Joe's Peace Palace Motel. In our room, the Injun Joe's embroidered on the towels had been changed with black marker to Indian Joe's. I wished everyone could just make up their minds. By now, I was used to staying in a room with Grandma and Gramps. Every night when they climbed into bed, they lay right beside each other on their backs, and Gramps said every single night, Well, this ain't our marriage bed, but it will do. Probably the most precious thing in the whole world to Gramps, besides Gram, was their marriage bed. This is what he called their bed back home in Bob Banks, Kentucky. One of the stories that Gramps likes to tell was about how he and all of his brothers had been born in that bed, and all Grandma Gramps' own children had been born in that same bed. When Gramps tells the story, he starts with when he was 17 years old and living with his parents in Bybanks. That's when he met Gram. She was visiting her aunt who lived over the meadow from where Gramps lived. I was a wild thing then, Gramps said, and I didn't stand still for any girl. I can tell you that. They had to try to catch Gramps on the run, but when he saw Gram running in the meadow with her long hair as silky as a filly's, he was the one who was trying to do the catching. Talk about wild things. Your grandmother was the wildest, most untamed, most ornery, and beautiful creature ever to grace this earth. Gramps said he followed her like a sick old dog for 22 days. And on the 23rd day, he marched up to her father and asked if he could marry her. Her father said, "If you can get her to stand still long enough, and if she'll have you, I guess you can." When Gramps asked Gram to marry him, she said, "Do you have a dog?" Gramps said that yes. As a matter of fact, he had a fat old beagle named Sadie. Gramps said, "And where does she sleep?" Gramps stumbled around a bit and said, "Well, to tell you the truth, she sleeps right next to me. But if we was to get married, I..." "And when you come in the door at night," Gramps said, "what does that dog do?" Gramps couldn't figure what she was getting at, so he just told the truth. "She jumps all over me, a licking and a howling." "And then what do you do?" Gramps said. "Well, gosh," Gramps said. He did not like to admit it, but he said, "I take her in my lap and I pet her until she calms down, and sometimes I sing her a song." "You're making me feel foolish." "Well, I don't mean to," she said. "You've told me all I need to know. I figure if you treat a dog that good, you'll treat me better. I figure if that old beagle Sadie loves you so much, I'll probably love you better. Yes, I'll marry you." They were married 3 months later. During the time between his proposal and their wedding day, Gramps and his father and his brothers built a small house in the clearing behind the first meadow. "We didn't have time," Gramps said, "to completely finish it. And there wasn't a single stick of furniture in it, but that didn't matter. We were going to sleep there on our wedding night all the same." They were married in an aspen grove on a clear July day, and afterwards they and all of their friends and relatives had a wedding supper on the banks of the river. During the supper, Gramps noticed that his father and two of his brothers were absent. He thought maybe they were playing a wet cheer, which is when the men kidnap the groom for an hour or so, and they all go out to the woods and share a bottle of whiskey. Before the end of supper, his father and brothers came back. But when they did not kidnap him for a wet cheer, Gramps was just as glad. He said, because he needed his wits about him that evening. At the end of supper, Gramps picked up Gram in his arms and carried her across the meadow. Behind them, everyone was singing, "Oh, meet me in the tulips when the tulips do bloom." This is what they always sing at weddings when the married couple leaves. It is supposed to be a joke, as if Gram and Gramps were going away by themselves and might not reappear until the following spring when the tulips were in bloom. Gramps carried Gram all the way across the meadow and through the trees and into the clearing where their little house stood. He carried her in through the door and took one look around and started to cry. The reason Gramps cried when he carried Gram into the house was that there, in the center of the bedroom, stood his own parents' bed. The bed that Gramps and each of his brothers had been born in. The bed his parents had always slept in. This was where his father and brothers had disappeared to during the wedding supper. They had been moving the bed into Grandma Gramps' new house. At the foot of the bed, wiggling and slurping, was Sadie, Gramps' old beagle dog. Gramps always ends this story by saying, "That bed has been around my whole entire life, and I'm going to die in that bed. And then that bed will know everything there is to know about me." So each night on our trip out to Idaho, Gramps petted the bed in the motel and said, "Well, this ain't our marriage bed, but it will do," while I lay in the next bed wondering if I would ever have a marriage bed like theirs. Bouncing Berkway. It was time to tell Grandma Gramps about Mr. Berkway. Mr. Berkway was mighty strange. I didn't know what to make of him. I thought that he might have a few squirrels in the attic of his brain. He was one of those energetic teachers who loved his subject half to death and leaped about the room dramatically, waving his arms and clutching his chest and whomping people on the back. He said, "Brilliant," and "wonderful," and "terrific." He was tall and slim, and his bushy black hair made him look wild, but he had enormous, deep brown, cow-like eyes that sparkled all over the place. And when he turned these eyes on you, you felt as if his whole purpose in life was to stand there and listen to you, and you alone. Midway through the first class, Mr. Berkway asked for everyone's summer journals, He flung himself up and down the aisles, receiving the journals as if they were manna from heaven. Wonderful, he said to each journal giver. I was worried. I had no journal. On top of Mary Lou Finney's desk were 6 journals. 6, Mr. Perkway said. Heavens, mercy! Is it? Can it be? Shakespeare? He counted the journals. 6! Brilliant! Magnificent! Chrissy and Megan, 2 girls who had their own club called the GGP, whatever that meant, were whispering over on the other side of the room and casting malevolent looks at Mary Lou's direction. Mary Lou kept her hand on top of the journals as Mrs. Berkway reached for them. In a low voice, she said, I don't want you to read them. What? Mr. Berkway boomed. Not read them? The horn was silent. Mr. Berkway scooped up Mary Lou's journal before she could even blink. He said, Don't be silly. Brilliant. Thank you. Another girl, Beth Ann, looked as if she might cry. Phoebe was sending me messages with her eyebrows that indicated that she was not too pleased either. I think they were all hoping that Mr. Bookway was not actually going to read their journals. Mr. Bookway went around the whole room snatching journals. Alex Cheevy's journal was covered with basketball stickers. Christy and Megan's was slathed over with pictures of male models. The covers of Ben's was a cartoon of a boy with a normal boy's head, but the arms and legs were pencils, and out of the tips of his hands and feet were dribbles of words. Then he got to Phoebe's desk. Mr. Bookway lifted up her plain journal and peeked inside. Phoebe was trying to slide down in the chair. I didn't write much, Phoebe said. In fact, I can hardly remember what I wrote about at all. By the time Mr. Berkway got to me, my heart was clobbering around so hard I thought it might leap straight out of my chest. Deprived child, he said. You didn't have a chance to write a journal? I'm new. New? How blessed, he said. There's nothing in the whole world that is better than a new person. So I didn't know about the journals. Not to worry, Mr. Berkway said. I'll think of something. I wasn't sure what that meant. I thought maybe he would give me a whole lot of extra homework or something. For the rest of the day, we could see little groups of people asking each other, Did you write about me? I was very glad I hadn't written anything. For a while, we didn't hear any more about the journals. We had absolutely no idea all the trouble they were going to cause. The rhododendron. One Saturday, I was at Phoebe's again. Her father was golfing and her mother was running errands. Mrs. Winterbottom had read out a long list to us of where she would be in case we needed her. If we heard any noises at all, we were supposed to call the police immediately. After you call the police, Mrs. Winterbottom said, call Mrs. Cadaver. I think she's home today. I'm sure that she would come right over. Oh, sure, Mrs. Phoebe whispered to me. That's about the last person I would call. Phoebe imagined that every noise was the lunatic sneaking in or the message leaver creeping up to drop off another anonymous note. She was so jumpy that I began to feel uneasy too. After our mother left, Phoebe said, Mrs. Cadaver works odd hours, doesn't she? Sometimes she works every night for a week, straggling home when most people are waking up. But sometimes she works during the day. She's a nurse, so I guess she works different shifts, I said. That day, Mrs. Cadaver was home, puttering around her garden. We saw her from Phoebe's bedroom window. Actually, puttering is not the best word. What she was doing was more like slogging and slashing. Mrs. Cadaver hacked branches off of trees and hauled these to the back of her loft where she lumped them into a pile of branches that she had hacked off last week. Told you she was as strong as an ox, Phoebe said. Next, Mrs. Cadaver slashed and sliced at a pitiful rose bush that had been trying to creep up the side of her house. When she sheared off the tops of the hedge that borders Phoebe's yard, she moved on to a rhododendron bush, which she was poking and prodding when a car pulled into her driveway. A tall man with bushy black hair leaped out and, seeing her, he practically skipped back to where she was. They hugged each other. Oh, no, Phoebe said. The man with the bushy black hair was Mr. Brookway, our English teacher. Mrs. Cadaver pointed to the rhododendron bush and then at the axe, but Mr. Brookway shook his head. He disappeared into the garage and returned with 2 shovels. Then he and Mrs. Cadaver gouged and prodded and tunneled around in the dirt until the poor old rhododendron flopped onto its side. They lugged the bush to the opposite side of the yard, where there was a mound of dirt, and they replanted the bush. Maybe there's something hidden under the bush, Phoebe said. Like what? Like Mr. Cadaver? As I told you before, maybe Mr. Brookway helped her chop up her husband and bury him, and maybe they were getting worried and decided to disguise the spot with a rhododendron bush. I must have looked skeptical. Phoebe said, Sal, you never can tell. And Sal, I don't think you or your father should go over there anymore. Well, I certainly agreed with her on that one. Dad and I had been there 2 nights early, and I had hardly been able to sit still. I started noticing all these frightening things in Margaret's house. Creepy masks, old swords, books with titles like The Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Skull of the Hatchet. Margaret cornered me in the kitchen and said, So what has your father told you about me? Nothing, I said. Oh, she seemed disappointed. My father's behavior was always different at Margaret's. At home, I would sometimes find him sitting on his bed, staring at the floor, or reading through old letters, or gazing at the photo album. He looked sad and lonely. But at Margaret's, he would smile and sometimes even laugh, and once he touched his once she touched his hand, and he let her hand rest there on top of his. I didn't like it. I didn't want my father to be sad, but at least when he was sad, I knew he was remembering my mother. So when Phoebe suggested that my father and I should not go to Margaret's, I was quite willing to agree with that notion. When Phoebe's mother came home from running all her errands, she looked terrible. She was sniffling and blowing her nose. Phoebe said that we were going to do our homework upstairs, I said. Maybe we should have help to put away the groceries. She likes to do all that by herself, Phoebe said. Are you sure? Of course I'm sure, Phoebe said. I've lived here my whole life, haven't I? She looked as if she'd been crying. Maybe something is wrong. Maybe something is bothering her. Don't you think that she would say so then? Maybe she's afraid to? I said, I wondered why it was so easy for me to see that Phoebe's mother was worried and miserable. But Phoebe couldn't see it. Or if she could, she was ignoring it. Maybe she didn't want to notice. Maybe it was too frightening a thing. I wonder if this was how it had been with my mother. Were there things that I didn't notice? Later that afternoon, when Phoebe and I went downstairs, Mrs. Winterbottom was talking with Prudence. Do you think I lead a tiny life? She asked. How do you mean? Prudence said, as she filed her nails. Do you have any nail polish remover? Phoebe's mother retrieved a bottle of nail polish remover from the bathroom. Oh, Prudence said. Before I forget, do you think you could sew up the hem on my brown skirt so I could wear it tomorrow? Oh, please. Prudence tilted her head to the side, tugged at her hair in exactly the same way Phoebe does, and smooshed up her mouth into a little pout. Doesn't Prudence know how to sew? I asked. Of course she does, Phoebe said. Why? I was just wondering why she doesn't sew her own skirt. Sal, you're becoming very critical. Before I left Phoebe's that day, Mrs. Winterbottom handed Prudence her brown skirt with the newly sewn hem, and all the way home I wondered about Mrs. Winterbottom, what she meant about living a tiny life. If she didn't like all that baking and cleaning and jumping up to get her bottles of nail polish remover and sewing hems, why did she do it? Why didn't she tell them to do some of the things themselves? Maybe she was afraid there would be nothing left for her to do. There would be no need for her, and she would become invisible, and no one would notice. Even I, when I got home that day, my father handed me a package. It's from Margaret, he said. What is it? Well, I don't know. Why don't you open it? Inside was a blue sweater. I put it back in the box and went upstairs. My father followed me. Sal, Sal, Do you like it? I don't want it, I said. She was just trying to. She likes you. I don't care if she likes me or not, I said. My father stood there looking around the room. I want to tell you something about Margaret, he said. Well, I don't want to hear it. I was feeling so completely ornery. When my father left the room, I could still hear my own voice saying, I don't want to hear it. I sounded exactly like Phoebe. Question for step 4.